I rode out on a bright May morning like a hero in a song, looking for a place called England, trying to find where I belong. Couldn't find the old flood meadow or the house that I once knew, no trace of that little river or the garden where I grew.
Our garden is Wanstead Park. Nestling at the southern tip of Epping Forest, it is an oasis of beauty and tranquility. The constant and insidious growth of London has reached and surrounded the forest, but not strangled it. Epping Forest appears to be a long green finger pointing down into the heart of London. Our park is a vital part of that green lung. In fact, it is only within the last 150 years that London has reached Wanstead. The history of the park is much, much longer, going back to Tudor times and beyond, when London was a distant spire or dome on the horizon. Its history was played out on a national as well as on a local scale. Over the centuries, the life and economy of the park has employed and motivated thousands of people, kings and commoners, landlords and labourers, scientists and artists, priests and politicians, makers and takers. Evidence of that history is apparent not only in the layout of the park, with its lakes and wooded glades, not only in its still existing buildings and artefacts, such as the temple, the old grotto, and the park gates. It is beneath the soil, remains of a Roman settlement abound, and it is all around us now, in the constant work to maintain its fabric and its character. In the layout of the surrounding area, Wanstead Flats, Wanstead Village, the golf course, Aldersbrook, Lake House, the City of London Cemetery, and beyond. This is the story of our garden, Wanstead Park revealed.
Wanstead Park. Now surely all of us know Wanstead Park or know of it. Wanstead Park. I swam in one of the lakes when I was a boy. I played ball boy for the tennis clubs over there. You remember, some of you, the tennis clubs over there? Oh, Wanstead Park. I left church with when I was about 17. I had a nice little girlfriend and I took her across to Wanstead Park and we sat by one of the lakes, the first lake from Blakemore Road, and looked at the moon in the reflection of the water. What happened after the reflection of the water, I don't remember. I was only 17.
Hello, my name is Matt Roberts. I'm the Superintendent of Epping Forest. And welcome to this section of the DVD where we look at the celebrations that have taken place in the local area over the last couple of years. We've celebrated 800 years of the parish of Wanstead. Its church, St Mary's, built on estate land. We've celebrated 150 years of the City of London Cemetery, likewise constructed on former estate land, and 125 years of the public opening of Wanstead Park. Without the City of London Cemetery, the Corporation of the City of London would never have been invited to become the conservator of Epping Forest and therefore purchased Wanstead Park in order to open it to the public for everybody's enjoyment. Later on in this section of the DVD there are chapters on the natural aspect of the area, the cultural history of the area and the present day use of Wanstead Park. And I look forward to welcoming you, if you're not already a regular walker in Wanstead Park, and your family, to come and enjoy the many and spectacular sights that are on offer there. Thank you.
Great to welcome you to Epping Forest and particularly to this area of it. 3 years since we were last here, and a different walk we thought we'd do this year from 2004. Thanks for being so brave to come out on such a blustery and rainy day. Just to say what we're going to do is now we're going to walk from here in a bit of a loopy route through Bush Wood, which was originally part of the 300-acre Wanstead Park estate. And still, of course, is part of Epping Forest, but now, as you have probably seen by our drive here, very much fragmented up and broken up from the original estate of the park itself. However, the historic links are very, very strong, and much of the landscape here, which I hope to show you today, is very much linked to what happened 350 years ago when Wanstead Park was first developed. When the Wanstead Park was, the house of Wanstead Park was being knocked down in the early 19th century, in 1823, 1824, the house was knocked down. The park was basically being fragmented. It looked like it was going to be lost, and Davis, with a lot of foresight, bought up this part of Bushwood, and then the City of London took it on, and hence we're here celebrating 125 years of the park. And at the time of taking it on, Superintendent Mackenzie at the time looked on the venerable sweet chestnuts, one of which we have over there, which we'll walk past in a minute, the one I'm about to take you to, which is behind us. He said of them, the crown's already dying back, they're already 200 years old. But I did worry that we had a sweet chestnut blight here, which is now all across Europe, and you can see it if you go to Spain. There are valleys of sweet chestnuts completely dead. And when I saw this in 2005, I thought, uh-oh, here we go. Well, it's wonderful to have you here to be witnesses to the fact that, well, at least the sweet chestnut blight is not yet here, touch wood it isn't, and these trees have survived that drought so far and put out sprouts all around just as they did in the 1940s. So what we're going to do is we're going to wander into this wonderful old veteran and walk round below it. It's a sort of one-way system, if you like, in the forest here. So if we walk to the right and then we'll loop round, and those of us at the front will then come out the back on that left-hand side.
Almost only half on, isn't it?
It's one of the gravel pits that was dug out for the turnpike roads, and of course the Turnpike Acts came in the 18th century, in the late 1700s, and the turnpike men had the rights to go on and get gravel from any common land they like, but it did bring them into conflict with forest law quite often. Indeed, MacAdam's men were actually prosecuted for taking gravel from Lord's bushes just to the north. But here we believe it's probably after the house collapsed and was torn down, and the estate went into liquidation in effect, that these gravel pits were dug. So probably in the early 19th century these date from. And they give us these wet hollows now, which are quite interesting, and we may yet make some more use of it, make some ponds with volunteer help. That's one of the plans in our site plan for this area. But just thought you'd like to see, because this whole site is pockmarked with gravels, and I'll return to gravels for our last stop on the walk just before we get back to the temple. We're actually in an area we now call Reservoir Wood, and that's, we'll see as we get out of here, we'll start to see the water bodies emerging in the grasslands to our east. But before we go on, another tree, and this one, in fact, isn't a tree at all. It's 9 trees in a bundle. Some people have said more, but I've counted them again this morning just to make absolutely sure there are 9. This is a so-called bundle planting, and this is the so-called Repton oak. And if Repton did indeed plant it, it was right towards the end of the park's life, because only 10 years after Repton did his watercolours and his drawings of the park, then the park was in liquidation and effectively being sold up and broken up. Nonetheless, Repton was here in 1813 doing his watercolour sketches for what would be his additions and changes to the park, making it more naturalistic. And one of the popular things at the time of the late 18th, early 19th century was to bundle plant. And that meant digging a hole and sticking in a bundle of trees, usually 9. There's lots of other bundles I know with 9 in, seems to be the optimum number. And they grow together, and anybody wants to have a look round, you can't do a complete circuit very easily, but you can see the great big ridges in the trunk demarcate the individuals of these trees. So it's the Repton oak, and a wonderful tree marking Repton's time here in the landscape. It's a tree that we're walking on, an area that you can see underneath is quite wet. There's a plant called water pepper all over the floor here. That indicates how wet it is. Of course, we're on the gravels here as well, and lots of water is travelling through the gravel aquifer here, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But we noticed this tree was in some problem and dying back, and we've opened up a number of paths around to take foot traffic away from here, although bringing a lot of foot traffic here today, to try and alleviate the problems on the routes here. And it does seem to be recovering somewhat from, say, 5 years or so ago when the work was done. So we can only keep our fingers crossed that this tree also will see out its 200th birthday, which it's getting very close to. So a wonderful tree and a very interesting thing. And it harks back to the days of where bundle planting actually was a very common thing, particularly in European wood pasture systems, where people would deliberately plant trees in a bundle where you had grazing animals and pigs in particular, and the bundles would be grown on to provide mast for the pigs to feed on in the autumn. So often beech was planted in bundles in forests and wood pastures throughout Europe. Particularly, there's a very good paper on this about what they did in Germany in medieval times to do this. So it's harking back to a very ancient tradition of what people did in planting trees in semi-natural areas. So a particularly nice example, and just another tree to remark on before we head into the sunshine. Really just, we've been walking, as you've probably seen, it's been pretty dry considering. I know we have the puddles just there, but it's largely dry because we've been walking on gravels. And the key to the park, and one of the reasons it was made into such a wonderful park and why it's now a Grade 2 star listed park, and loved by many people, and English Heritage have put it on that listing. And James tells me the listing it certainly deserves that height, possibly even higher in the future. One of that is because we've got these fantastic waterways. We walked past Shoulder of Mutton Pond, looking really rather nice at the moment, and that's looked a lot worse in the recent drought. So it's lovely to see that water level so high. A water body we couldn't see was the octagonal basin, which fed the whole system. So the octagonal basin fed into the Shoulder of Mutton, and then water would come down into this pond here, which is one of the larger ones, which is Heronry Pond. And it got lined in the early part of the 20th century by concrete, which you can see around the edges here. As you'll see as we walk along, you'll see the concrete liner. Now, interestingly, as well as being fed from the basin, it was also there's general seepage here through those gravels. Those gravels form effectively an aquifer. Gradually, all the buildings around the area of Leytonstone and Leyton have taken land that was feeding the aquifer with water. So it's made it more and more difficult for these systems, particularly with drier summers, to fill up, and to fill up with the regularity they used to do when it was built, when they were built sort of 250 years ago or so. So a very big system of water, nearly fell off the back there, and now we've lost a great aquifer that's fed the water, great big area of gravel. And this is the gravels that came from the River Thames itself. The River Thames used to be much further north, tens of thousands of years ago. The glaciations gradually moved it south until the sort of final glaciation, and it now of course exits in the Thames estuary that we know of, but it used to exit over at in the middle of Essex in the Blackwater and the Crouch estuaries, which is why they're so much bigger than they should be. And it gradually came down south, leaving lots and lots of gravels everywhere, and here you've got a wonderful series of stepped gravels which we've been gradually walking down, and we're now on the lowest of them, which is the Taplow gravels, which feeds the water in the Heronry and also down on the Perch Pond, which is just beyond where you'll be eating at lunchtime. Now we've lost a lot of that water, so we've got a real problem, and with these drier summers it has been a problem. We've put a borehole in to help feed our water, and that's been a great success relatively, because when I first knew the Heronry it was bone dry most of the time, and actually since the borehole went in 5 years ago it's mostly had some water in. As you probably realise, what's remarkable is considering how wet it's been, and we had a fairly wet winter as well, that level is stubbornly down by at least a metre along the concrete, and as you can see as you look back and as you walk past it. Part of the reason is Heronry is a little bit higher than the aquifer itself, the general water level in the aquifer. Perch Pond is absolutely perched. Well, I'm sure the name came from the fish rather than the fact that it sits beautifully on the water level of the aquifer as it can be maintained now. This is about 1 metre too high. The other problem it's got, believe it or not, is the concrete liner, which ironically was put in to stop the water leaking out. We had a few holes knocked in the Second World War, which doesn't help, and its wooden battens between the concrete, they rotted away and so water could leak out. But actually, a hydrologist has told us that almost certainly the concrete is stopping the water getting in. So we're going to get a big bulldozer one day, we hope. I've got to chat with James about this, but it would be great to see some of that concrete gone, particularly the rather ugly concrete at the top, and actually allow the gravels, which sit right up to the top level, to let that water in over the top. That's one of the hope we've got, as well as also renegotiating our borehole licence with the Environment Agency, as we're doing currently to keep water coming into the Heronry. But that's why the water level's low, if anybody wants to know why, after all this amazing amount of rain.
Thank you very much for your welcome here today, coming at a very special time in the history of Epping Forest and Wanstead Park in particular. And we were so lucky back in 1878 when the Epping Forest Act was passed and the Corporation of London agreed to take on responsibility for it and provide this green lung for us here. And it's really a very, very special place for enjoyment and recreation. tucked away, in the suburban streets that surround it. It really must be an absolute delight for people living in Wanstead and Epping to be able to enjoy this facility with its historic roots back in Wanstead House all those years ago. And I was just hearing a few minutes ago about the work you're doing to try and find out where all the exhibits are from the auction of Wanstead House, which would be absolutely fascinating to trace where they've all got to, because that really is part of the very precious history of this part of the world. Thank you very much, and we wish Wanstead Park great success over the next 125 years. Thank you.
What a magnificent assembly! Look at it all, William!
Hey, God, what a rabble!
What a magnificent assembly! Look at it all, William!
Hey, God, what a rabble! Wah!
Ding!
Woo! That's enough of that. Okay.
The Master of Ceremonies is going to be played by Matt Stevens, Robert Stevens? Matt Roberts. Why am I saying Matt Stevens? Sorry. Matt Roberts.
At Wanstead House, yes, the pride of Essex, an evening of music, dance and theatrics, Mr. Wellesley Pole and Catherine his wife ask me to ask you to lay aside strife, wander at leisure through woodlands and glades, where pretty girls sport with dashing young blades.
In fact, you could get away with a hairband, nice elasticated hairband, and those secured at the back, and you're done. What a magnificent assembly! Look at it all, William!
Hey, God, what a rabble!
Ladies and gentlemen, pray, how do you do? If you are happy, me happy too. Master is so fond of him. What, Toby? You cross this morning? Nasty, naughty, crying child.
Every woman is fair game to a predatory amorist, and that, dear wife, is what I am. Yes, I like that. A predatory amorist. The richest woman in England, you see, and the nagging wench never lets him forget it. Frederick? Frederick, oh, bugger.
Good coin, Mr. Devil. I never did you any harm, but all the good that was in my power. Oh, what will become of me?
No.
Ready? Bang.
Huzzah! The devil's dead.
I worry that, like Mr. Punch, he'll end up having the last laugh.
So we decided it would be too wet on the foot, it would be too wet for the audience to sit on the grass. It's slippery, very slippery out there, and the musicians have got to think about their instruments and so on. So we took the decision very early this morning that we were going to decamp completely for the rest of the day to St Gabriel's, which is on Park Road.
Went well.
Here's my shot again, you see.
Yeah, I know you like that shot, don't
Well,
you?
only when they've got certain people in it.
I can't move that fast, Virginia.
Come on, old man.
This is where we're going to plant this oak tree in commemoration of 150 years of the opening of the cemetery. The tree is to be formally planted and a plaque placed by the chairman of the committee responsible for the cemetery, Mr. John Brewster.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Lord Mayor of the City of London Corporation, it is my pleasant duty to plant this tree to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the opening of this cemetery by the City of London. Many people ask me, what have you done for 150 years? And my answer is simple enough. Just look around you and see the place that we have here. The 8 Grade 2 listed buildings, not to say the least of it, all the gardens.
Staff are worried you're going to make them redundant.
I duly declare the tree planted.
So we're here at the City of London Cemetery, which was opened by the Corporation of the City of London in 1856. They'd acquired the cemetery a few years earlier to provide a new burial ground for the residents of the square mile, which is where most people lived at that time. So in the early part of the 19th century, the churchyards in the city were becoming overcrowded. The idea was, of course, that you would be buried in the churchyard, and then after maybe 50 years, somebody else would be buried there. It was called reuse. They reused the graves over and over again. Well, of course, as the population grew and the number of deaths grew, this capacity in the city just wasn't able to cope with the number of bodies that had to be buried. And it got to absolutely appalling conditions where bodies were being disturbed within a matter of weeks of being buried. And of course it became a scandal and an outrage and a public nuisance. People believed that the miasma of gases that came from the cemeteries were killing people, poisoning your food and your larder. And so there was this big rush to try and say, well, let's close the churchyards, let's create new cemeteries outside the city, and then we'll all be better off. Hence, this great cemetery was constructed.
Ian, we're now above the catacombs. Can you tell us the history of this part of the City of London Cemetery?
Certainly. Well, this area was originally a lake, and in fact we know it as Catacomb Valley. And when you actually enter the cemetery, originally you could see all the way from the main gate right the way down to the lake, the end of the lake. And the architect of the cemetery, William Hayward, decided that this would be the centrepiece of the cemetery. The idea was to be really impressive, and it is indeed quite an impressive building, in keeping with all of the other historic buildings, all designed in a neo-Gothic style. And in fact the centrepiece is the catacomb, where people are buried above ground in cells, and each end has been converted into a columbarium, which is the same thing but for urns which stand in niches above ground. So this lake was actually drained as part of the preparations for building the cemetery, and then in 1974 they added this modern building, which is the crematorium. Bit of a problem because obviously it now
takes away the main vista which you were meant to get when you came into the entrance and see the great... In fact, one of the original engravings show, as you come into the cemetery, a big open area, and in the distance you can see the catacomb.
It's interesting that an area that once was a place of leisure is now a place of sorrow and remembrance and respect.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because the architect of the cemetery was designing this as a place of pleasure. It wasn't just meant to be a place to bury the dead and to mourn. No, it was, in fact, it was meant to be an open space where, if you look at the original engravings, you will see people walking for leisurely walks with their children, enjoying a Sunday afternoon.
I understand.
That was the intention.
Yes.
It was meant to be a place where you appreciated architecture, nature, trees, the whole, everything really to do with life, not just death.
Yes, and even in autumn, as with now, it still works, doesn't it?
It does, and there are over 3,000 trees in this cemetery, every sort of variety you can think of. It is a wonderful park where people are buried.
Good. My lords, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to Wanstead. I hope you're going to have a pleasant afternoon with me.
Stitch, stitch, in poverty, hunger and dirt, and still with a voice of dolorous pitch.
As I look around, I do see changes.
The summer outing of the Wanstead Historical Society includes a visit to his house.
At nearly every entrance to the park, as well as in many other places.
Put your arm across your middle.
This is believed to be the heart of Sir John Tilney.
Hello and welcome to Wanstead Park. My name's Peter Lawrence, and myself and others will, on this film, try and create in various ways the history of this once grand landscape garden here to the east of London within the historic county of Essex. The story is long and involved and ever-changing. We can start perhaps with the Tudor period, when this great estate was a royal hunting park and lodge with names like Elizabeth I, Henry VIII, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Leicester, all these people in the Tudor period. Then we come on to the 17th century with the governing figures of the East India Company, with their incredible riches and how they enhanced this estate. And then on to the final period with a great Palladian mansion in the 18th and 19th century. And when, in the early 19th century, the heiress to this estate married the nephew of the Duke of Wellington, whose character, shall we say, was definitely questionable. And he blew the fortune, and so we have no house. We have no ornamental gardens. But since the 1880s, this has been part of Epping Forest, now owned by the Corporation of the City of London. And it's a lovely public open space. But we're going to try and recreate some of the features in this once glorious park. Features that are still in existence as earthworks, but we'll try and perhaps daydream and try and create some of the grandeur that was once part of a hunting forest. But then this estate has evolved many, many times, but it reached its zenith in the mid-18th century, when some people would even today describe that it was the equivalent and perhaps known as the English Versailles.
बच्चों बच्चा काला बच्चा धोला बच्चा काला बच्चा हरे पैर अगला दो बच्चा
For those of you who are not so familiar with the Wanstead House estate and where everything was, for instance, here we are on Wanstead Golf Course with the clubhouse behind us, which of course was the stable block for the estate. And elsewhere on this huge golf course, we have large bunkers, small bunkers, survival of walkways, early 19th century parterres, and they are literally all around us. But let's look at a couple of examples. And for those golfers who think they're just on a golf course, perhaps there's more than meets the eye. Records show by 1715, Sir Richard Child was ready to build. By 1720, the house was habitable. This house, at the time it was built to the designs of Colin Campbell, was architecturally unique in the country, with its unrelieved front, which means a flat-fronted Portland stone rendered building. And the only part of the building that breaks that unrelieved line is, of course, the great porch facing towards London. Over the next 100 years, through the Child family, into the Tilney Longs, and then, of course, the final act in the beginning of the 19th century, when the heiress, Catherine Tilney Long, marries the nephew of the Duke of Wellington, William Pole Wellesley. And most of us know that his dubious character meant that he blew the family fortunes in 10 years, and by 1822, there was a great sale here of all the interior fixtures and fittings to pay some of his debts. Then the debtors were back again. They tried to sell in 1823, no takers, and the final act in 1824 was that the house was sold for building material, and a house that cost perhaps about £360,000 in 18th century money was sold in 19th century money for just £10,000. And part of the deal was it had to be removed from the face of the earth. And so all we have left here on Wanstead Golf Course, site of the house, is this huge hole in the ground. Some 260 feet from north to south, the frontage, facing towards London, and the depth of the house, nearly 80 feet from its west or London side through to the garden front, which faced towards the River Roding and Ilford. And this is all we have left to remind us of this great and emphasise at the time it was built, architecturally unique in this country. coming out of the huge hole in the ground that was the site of Wanstead House, I'd like to point out the site of perhaps the last great garden feature. In 1815, William Pole Wellesley invited the landscape gardener Humphrey Repton onto the estate to seek ideas for improvement. And one of the improvements that definitely was put into place was a great parterre in front of the house on the London facing side. Unfortunately, this parterre only lasted about 7 years. It's clearly shown on estate maps for that period, but by 1824, parish maps of the estate shows the parterre apparently has disappeared. This parterre was made up of 4 St Andrew's crosses linked together in a big square. And from there, it sat just here. And if you look carefully, you can see some of the ridges of the St Andrew's cross shapes, and where the grass is slightly browner here, and another one coming in there, that was made up of 4 of these, more or less where the first tees are here on Wanstead Golf Course today. The elevated sections were the gravel paths, and in between were planted beds. And the whole of the large square was encased in hedging, perhaps of yew, and arches in and out of this beautiful feature. It must have looked beautiful, but as I say, plans tend to indicate that this feature lasted only 7 years. Bearing in mind, of course, that William Pole Wellesley was, in 1815, 3 years married to the heiress Catherine, 3 years of getting rid of her money. And there was only 7 years to go before the money had gone. And it appears that all these expensive features that needed to be maintained, and here you can see again the way the brown grass grows there, one path, and then another path along there. But it must have been just literally removed because of the cost involved. The main grounds of Wanstead House, in my opinion, were on 2 levels. The level that we can see me walking across on this elevated walkway, which was the area around the house. But to the south of the house, there was a lower level. And from here, you can see the ground drops dramatically, and then looking in the distance to what we now call Canary Wharf, some people call a mini Manhattan. And if you took all the trees and indeed some of the buildings away in the foreground, you can understand that we are on an elevated position, and therefore the great Wanstead House could be seen for miles around, especially on the approach from the southwest, from the city, and indeed from where all the money came from for the Child family, the East India Company, and of course the London docks. Another landscape feature that's well known to many on the Wanstead Golf Course is of course the lake, or to give it its architectural term, the basin. Before 1707, some sketch maps of the estate suggest that there were 2 ponds here in the shape of 2 Ds facing one another with a causeway through the middle. But in 1707, that causeway was removed and the lake as we see it today was shaped. The island in the middle, of course, is on the site of the centre section of the causeway. The lake itself had many straight sides to make the complete circuit, very similar to the Great Basin in Kensington Gardens. And indeed, I'm sure there are quite a few people living in Wanstead, and when they were of a certain juvenile age, would perhaps come into the grounds, walk across the golf course, into the water here at the lake at the appropriate point, and they would actually find the remnants of the causeway round about knee high to a 14-year-old teenager. whose name will remain anonymous.
Here's a view from down in the bottom of the hole that was Wanstead House on the day that Stuart is filming from the cherry picker. So here's the width from front to rear. Golfer just going across the little causeway, and then up on the London side, and you can see the cherry picker coming into view. With the intrepid Stuart at the top.
Wanstead Park has existed as an enclosed park for over 500 years, but for various reasons its shape and size, its boundaries, have changed quite dramatically over the years. This is the enclosed deer park of the 1590s. This is the park at its zenith in 1813. And this is the park now, the current integrated site management plan, i.e. the plan that is guiding the present planning for the park by the City of London. Even here, the plan states that there is some confusion as to what is the boundary of the park. The boundary is a demarcation point between landowners or land use. Thus, the main factors affecting boundary changes historically are change of ownership and change of use. In medieval times, much of the land was in common use. That is, it was known as common land and was used for the common good. But over the centuries, this land was encroached on and enclosed, with much taken into private ownership. In the early 19th century, William Pole Tilney Long Wellesley set man-traps on some of his estates and tried unsuccessfully to block time-honoured entrances to Wanstead Park. Entry to the Royal St James's Park was by key. Over 6,500 keys were issued to ensure that the hoi polloi were excluded. The current most significant factor affecting boundaries is road building. Our purpose here is for Peter to take you round the key points which delineate the current accepted boundaries, as well as areas now beyond the Pale, such as Aldersbrook, Lake House and Bushwood, all of which were once included within the park. The Pale was the Tudor fence or barrier originally intended to keep the deer within the park.
Let's try and identify the approach road to the Wanstead House estate. Behind me is the Green Man roundabout, as you can see, with a big Tesco's supermarket. The old London to Norwich road. And you would turn off the road down this little lane as it was, and we are now in Bush Road. And as we come to Bush Road, London Borough of Waltham Forest. And just here is Bush Road, London Borough of Redbridge, the old parish boundaries between the old parish of Leighton and the parish of Wanstead. So we're now in the lordship of Wanstead, going down Bush Road, now dead straight approach road to the formal entrance gates to Wanstead House. Here at the junction of today's Bush Road, Blake Hall Road and Overton Drive are the two ornamental processional entrance gates or gate posts into the Wanstead House estate. Let's have a closer look at one of the ornamental gate pillars to Wanstead House estate. You can see from here the entwined initials of Richard Child, the owner and the builder of the last great classical Wanstead house, designed by Colin Campbell. And also above you can see a ball. There is one on each pillar. They're quite modern. Old photographs suggest there was nothing on top, or maybe perhaps when the house was first built there would have been carved images of pineapples. Pineapples, a sign of hospitality and affluence in the 18th century when the great house was built. In today's urban chaos of traffic all around us, let's just try to imagine that we're going to walk into the estate. So we pass the ornamental pillars and we walk into today's Overton Drive. A few yards into Overton Drive, there would have been a second set of wrought iron gates, which would have been opened for you by a gatekeeper. And then you would have walked in to the approach road, down towards where the lake, or in the 18th century they would have called it the basin, in front of Wanstead House. You would have passed either side of the lake to come up in front of the great Palladian mansion. Today's Overton Drive takes you just to the left or to the north of the lake. Now, of course, on towards St Mary's Church, part of course, the original Wanstead House estate. Here we are outside St Mary's Church, Wanstead, built by Thomas Hardwick in 1790, and the church stands within the grounds of the park of Wanstead House. Just a brief couple of points about the architecture of St Mary's. First of all, it superseded the original medieval church, which the site is within the grounds of the churchyard on the other side. The style of the church is meant to reflect the style of the fantastic Palladian mansion that used to stand just 250 yards to the south of here. Portland stone, the portico front, simple lines of the Georgian period, but the classical lines there just to impress everybody as they came past here on their way to visit the house. And indeed, where the church is today was one of the major access points into the estate itself. So let's just go around the church and find other points of interest. So we're at the east end of the outside of St Mary's Church, and here is in Latin, the original dedication stone. Two or three names to mention. James Tilney Long, George Bowles. He was owner of the Grove at Wanstead. That estate used to be situated behind where the shops are now in Wanstead High Street. A large estate that went all the way down to the River Roding from Wanstead High Street. So it was the Tilney Longs and George Bowles who were the main orchestrators of the building of this new church. And finally, Samuel Glass, the rector, the first rector, who was here and part of the dedication of this new church. He was a chaplain to the royal family, so once again, as chosen to be the rector here, he was top of the tree as far as the incumbents were. And of course, very much part and parcel of keeping the standards up, shall we say. The church was now a new standard to match the great standard of the classical house. Whilst we're by the church, the entrance here today that takes you down to the tennis courts and the cricket club at Wanstead was the site perhaps of one of the gates that were put up temporary by William Pole Wellesley in order to stop access into the park. This caused great local consternation. One reason was, of course, it would stop locals' ancient rights of common grazing on what was, even though it was a private estate, was part and within Epping Forest. And so several locals took it into their own hands to break the gates down. And we think that here on this side of the estate, nearest to the village, this is one of the gates or the gateways that would have been attacked. William was taken to court at Chelmsford, and the locals successfully applied to make him tear down all these temporary gates in order that once again they could enact their ancient rights of common grazing and access onto his parkland. Here we are in Redbridge Lane West by Wanstead High School. This is the site of the rectory for Wanstead Parish. And this old tree that I'm standing beside has seen all the changes. Indeed, when the school was built between World War I and World War II, the rectory itself survived a little longer on the site now occupied by this modern low-line classrooms here. The rectory was not just a place of residence for the incumbent of Wanstead Parish, it was also a place of science. If you think of James Pound, Bradley, and indeed Isaac Newton, all had a part to play in the history of Wanstead, especially when it came to astronomy. The telescope in Wanstead Park, the influence of these people, both local and within London, would visit here and discuss the science and indeed create their experiments here in the park itself. Another boundary location of the Wanstead House estate is here at the River Roding, beside today's busy hustle and bustle of the Eastern Avenue going towards Redbridge and up to Gants Hill. I think at this location, just upstream, where today's Bupa Roding Hospital is, that was a Roman crossing point on the Stratford to Dunmow Roman Road. But here was the site of the original Red Bridge. And the Red Bridge was basically a red brick triple arch bridge, one of a whole series of bridges built to ease traffic across the River Roding, not only here at Wanstead but also at Woodford, at Loughton, at Abridge and Passingford Bridge. These bridges of course have all disappeared with the exception of the one at Abridge. Here of course, with the Eastern Avenue being built in the 1920s and further expanded as traffic has got heavier and heavier. And so of course we think about the River Roding in terms of its use within the ornamental waters at Wanstead House, and the fact that since the ornamental waters were developed from round about 1700 onwards, the Roding was an increasingly important feature and indeed source of the wonderful gardens that once were at Wanstead House. We're here to the east of Wanstead Park. You can see the A406. We're in Wanstead Lane, a 1920s and 30s street of family homes. But here, at number 188 Wanstead Lane, is something different. A leftover from the past, a Victorian farmhouse, part of the Stone Hall estate that was once part of the Wanstead Park area. Unfortunately, there is a planning notice in the window here at 188 applying for demolition in order to provide some flats. But that's progress. You can see it is quite a symmetrical, perhaps early 19th century house with a central doorway and chimneys at either end with a slate roof. But that is all that's left of what was part of Wanstead Park, the Stone Hall estate. I'm sure everybody can recognise Valentine's Mansion. And in fact, it is part of the Wanstead House story, both location and indeed owners. Location-wise, at the height of Wanstead House estate, going eastward from Wanstead, through its parklands, through the Highlands estate, it's hard to imagine today that some of the perimeter tracks of that grand estate included Wanstead Lane, Beehive Lane, and indeed the estate finished in what we now call the Cranbrook Road, right opposite here at Valentine's Mansion. The second aspect that connects Valentine's house here with Wanstead House are the owners. The Child family, of course, were governors of the East India Company, and Richard Child subsequently. They were all major players in the East India Company, and including here, the man who built the present Valentine's Mansion, Charles Raymond, was also an East Indiaman and an East India captain. So it's one of many families who had their income, or part of their income, through the East India Company that made this part of Essex the site of their wonderful country estates. Right, I've just left my car in Exeter Gardens, Ilford, walking up towards the 406. You can hear the noise, surely. But behind me is the old Highlands estate, which again was, like Stone Hall estate, was one of the additional acquisitions to act as a backdrop to the main garden, which we now call Wanstead Park. So you can see Highlands School, or just the rooftop of Highlands School, roughly on the spot of the original Highlands house. Some people call this progress. The A406 cut through in the early 1970s, which in some way has improved access to Wanstead Park, but you can hear by the noise, of course, that this is now, the 406, is now the modern boundary for Wanstead Park. Here we are to the east of Wanstead Park. Immediately beside me is the River Roding. And beyond is an 18th century retaining wall with the canal of the ornamental waters. And then beyond that is the great glade leading up to the horizon where the great and last house at Wanstead stood. In my opinion, the ornamental waters were the icing on the cake of the landscaping of Wanstead Park between 1720 and 1745. So, looking at the canal, which was originally in the rock map of 1735 called the Strait, and then beyond there was a canal. The River Roding at that time interacted with the ornamental waters, and indeed in my opinion the River Roding, perhaps the original route, was within the ornamental waters. But sometime in the mid-18th century they excluded the River Roding completely from the ornamental waters and rerouted it to its present site in front of me here. Just a few yards away from the 18th century retaining wall, further along the River Roding, we have this depression here. Now, a lot has happened in the 1970s with the building of the 406, an extension of the M11. You can see and hear the noise of the traffic behind me. But here is a depression, perhaps that's left over from what's clearly shown on some 18th and early 19th century estate maps as being a loop of the River Roding, which would loop from here around to the east and then to the south, going back into the main Roding just beyond the ornamental water system. There's lots to talk about and point out along the Roding here. For instance, across the other side, the Wanstead Park side of the Roding, you can see a marker post. That's quite modern, it's 20th century, but it marks the boundary of Ilford parish, where we're standing now. Wanstead parish, of course, being the other side. And the mere fact that an Ilford parish marker is on what we would describe as the Wanstead side, to me indicates that the roading here as it is now, the original route was moved when the ornamental waters were starting to be excavated in the 1720s through to the 1740s. I've just found a golf ball because we're quite close to Ilford Golf Club. And beside the river roading here reminds us of the constrictions of today's boundaries of Wanstead Park with the boundaries that go beyond the Pale into areas of which are no longer considered part of Wanstead Park. Ilford Golf Course, Highlands, Stone Hall. And as we go over the bridge here, over the roading, into the park today, over, unfortunately, a modern concrete bridge today, but on the site of an earlier, much earlier rustic timber bridge, which gave access from one part of the estate into the formal gardens here in what is now called Wanstead Park. I'm walking from the bridge that takes you over the A406 into Wanstead Park, and now I'm entering the area that was the old Wanstead sewer farm. Now, going back to the fact that Wanstead Park has been part of Epping Forest, when the corporation purchased the park in 1882. Within the Epping Forest Act is a proviso that if in the future the forest lost any of its ground, then that ground would be compensated by some form of replacement area. And here's a classic case that during the 1970s, with so much road building around here, the forest was dissected and pared away. Here we are in the extreme southeast corner of Wanstead Park. You're looking at an open field, the site of the old Wanstead sewer farm, and adjacent to this was the old Wanstead Parish Isolation Hospital. So the park in some way, and Epping Forest, have of course expanded here because this ground was given in exchange for land lost for modern road building. Where we are, in fact, is adjacent to an old lordship, the Lordship of Aldersbrook, part of Little Ilford, but of course, since 1856, has been the City of London Cemetery. This, of course, was part of the Manor of Aldersbrook, part of the parish of Little Ilford, and was purchased by the Corporation of London in 1856 for their cemetery. Continuing the theme of the outer boundaries of the Wanstead estate. Here we are at Centre Road on the southern part of Wanstead Flats, where Centre Road merges into Woodgrange Road. And let's think about the Tudor period, when coming from the great road from London to Colchester, you would turn north through the gate into the forest at Forest Gate, and in triumphant procession, as so many of the Tudors did, would ride up through what we now call quite boringly Centre Road to the great Tudor hunting lodge, which became known as Wanstead House. So we continue. Just think about what has happened since and what we can see today. Here we have the Victorian, late Victorian built environment. where indeed after the Epping Forest Act of 1878, some people would call this part of Epping Forest the Cockney Playground. And here the Victorian trams stopped at the terminus here at the beginning of Centre Road. But let's look at this great open space, Wanstead Flats. In the Tudor period, this would have been called Wanstead Heath. And in 1553, a young Princess Elizabeth met her half-sister, Mary Tudor, on Mary's way in triumph into London to be proclaimed Queen of England. And even subsequent centuries, there were great mass meetings here, military manoeuvres, and it's always been a place of public assembly. Indeed, at this southern part of Wanstead Flats, there were mass meetings even to hopefully save, and of course successfully save, Epping Forest as a public open space. And indeed, into the 20th century, looking towards the pond, which many of EastEnders would have enjoyed, and that little circle of trees just coming into view now, where there was a great bandstand, and there were many, many seats. Indeed, many of us can remember when there were many park benches around here where you could sit and listen to the band. But at least even if the bandstand has gone, we can still remember that particular picture as we look at that circle of trees today. Let's use our imagination for a few minutes and looking north through Centre Road and looking across Wanstead Flats, and if you can see that block of flats in the distance and the lower houses just to the right of it. Imagine in the 18th century this grand white Portland stone classical house you could have seen from here, and you would have been intrigued and wanted to get closer and closer, as many grand visitors did when they were coming from London to see the last great classical Wanstead house. Here on the edge of the Aldersbrook estate, it's relevant to speak about the last few decades of the private ownership of the Wanstead estate. In 1878, Henry Wellesley, Earl Cowley, gave the Wanstead Park lands to the Corporation of London to put into the Epping Forest portfolio, which of course Wanstead was open to the public in 1882. Part of that deal was that he received £80,000 and also this area which became developed. The third and final exit ownership of the estate was the selling of what is now the Wanstead Golf Course, Wanstead Tennis Club and Cricket Club to a consortium of sportsmen in 1920. And so you have the three main sections of the estate. Aldersbrook estate, Wanstead Park, and of course the golf course beyond, where the site of the last house is.
So there it is. Wanstead Park boundaries have changed and are still changing. The integrated site plan puts it like this. The western boundary runs down the track from Warren Road through Heronry Pond. Many people find it difficult to imagine why this should be.
I'm standing on George Green, part of Epping Forest, beneath a couple of fantastic sweet chestnut trees. which were planted about 1720 by Sir Richard Child. Some years earlier, his father had planted walnuts in avenues radiating out from the house at Wanstead. But these had died because of the cold winters in the early years of the 18th century. These sweet chestnuts were part of the radiating avenues that survived those plantings, and throughout the centuries they have grown and become the magnificent trees that they are today.
The great tree plantations of Wanstead began towards the end of the 17th century. Wanstead was not alone. Such plantations took place in many of the great estates throughout the country. Why were so many trees planted? It has been said that it was the fashion of the times, but fashion isn't created out of thin air. In the 17th century, wood was the single most important natural resource after food, as it had been for centuries. As fuel and as a building material, it was depended on by all sections of the community. But by the time of the restoration of the monarchy, wood was in very short supply. The civil wars and the upheavals of Cromwell's republic had devastated the forests. It was John Evelyn, the diarist and an eminent horticulturalist, who spearheaded the campaign for re-afforestation. In his book Silver, the first publication of the newly formed Royal Society, he showed his venom towards those he held responsible for the destruction of the forests.
But what then shall I say of our late prodigious spoilers, whose furious devastations of so many goodly woods and forests have left an infamy on their names and memories, not quickly to be forgotten? I mean our unhappy usurpers and injurious sequestrators.
And his veneration of the newly restored monarchy.
No jewel in your Majesty's resplendent crown can render you so much lustre and glory as your regards to navigation. So, nor can anything impeach your navigation and the reputation of that, while you continue thus careful of your woods and forest.
Navigation is the crucial word. New worlds were being explored, the source of previously unheard of treasures. The great rush to outmaneuver rival powers in the quest to capture these treasures was underway. He who ruled the seas had a great advantage. Ships, more ships, and yet more ships were needed, both to carry the merchandise and to protect it from foreign powers and pirates. Ships were built with wood. A third-rate 74-gun ship of the line could take up to 3,800 trees, which meant about 75 acres of woodland. In 1667, John Evelyn visited Sir Josiah Child, the new owner of Wanstead Park. Child was the despotic governor of one of the most rapacious of the new companies, the East India Company, ploughing the fortune he was plundering back into the plantations at Wanstead.
I went to see Sir Josiah Child's prodigious cost in planting walnut trees about his seat and making fish ponds many miles in circuit in Epping Forest in a barren spot, as oft-times these suddenly moneyed men for the most part seat themselves.
But Evelyn's apparent contempt does not appear to have prevented him acquainting himself with the Childs. The one remaining avenue originally planted in the 17th century in Bushwood is known as Evelyn's Avenue. Evelyn's Avenue has been portrayed in many forms over the last 100 years and more. And though the trees have come and gone, the avenue still looks fantastic, especially in its autumn colours. Bushwood is one of the most magical corners of the parklands. Sweet chestnuts from the Child era still remain. Tricia and her students carried out research to try to ascertain their age.
Munching the crab apples under this was a self-seeded apple.
You're going to have to hold it there.
1980s, and
5.55?
Yep.
How much?
5.55.
do the distance between the two.
And so they came to the witch's tree.
And our challenge this afternoon is to try and measure its girth. But these may in fact date from the first planting. Measuring it will give us an idea of possibly how long it's been here.
Yeah, they've got it. Okay.
8.1 metres. Metres. We've got two teams, so okay. So if somebody wants to bit of science there, shall I hold it this end? And then we're going to do these ones. 18 centimetres.
We had a very severe thunderstorm, and a man from Tennyson Avenue was on his way home from Wanstead with his dog on the lead, and the storm came on very suddenly, a lot of heavy rain, thunder, lightning and hail, and he sheltered here under the trees. I can't remember the month, but the trees had all their leaf canopy on, and this tree was struck by lightning in the storm, and unfortunately he was killed instantly, and his dog was knocked unconscious, but she survived. And it was quite a shock to us all because he was well known in the area. His name was Bill Harrington, and his dog's name was Annie. And in fact, she lived to be 18.
Yes.
Okay. Stay there.
Do you need the tape measure, David, to judge
Yes,
where
Have we got 45 degrees on that one?
17.4.
Yeah, so that would be a bit in line with what the other one is.
Have we got girth measurements yet?
No. Oh, that was this one, just the last one of this row, wasn't it? I thought I said that. Remember, this isn't. Well, I could do a movie, I suppose.
I wouldn't if I was. That's my job.
Go with that.
We'll go with that, because I think it's tea time. We've come to Greenwich Park to do a comparison with the trees of Wanstead, because we know that here in Greenwich the trees were planted about 1660, because that's when the monarchy was restored, and they wanted to renovate the park here along the French lines, and garden designers like Lenotre had actually planted up magnificent gardens in France, and so the English wanted to follow the same style, and so sweet chestnuts were chosen as making very good avenue trees, and this is one of the fantastic survivors from that time.
6.5.
You have seen the enthusiasm of the group working under difficult conditions, and their findings are that this tree is so much larger than others. At 8.2 metres, it could be well over 500 years old and would have been a significant feature in the Tudor landscape. The expansion of London in the 19th century gave rise to changes in the form of roads and railways, and of course the building of many houses. The increasing volumes of traffic in the 20th century brought further disruption to the landscape with the creation of the M11 link road and the substantial modifications at the Green Man roundabout. Thus, there was an opportunity to create new habitats as a part of this traffic scheme. These adult students are exploring the plants and insects surviving in this deliberately seeded green oasis in the middle of the underpass.
Dead straight lines, that means it's a meadow grasshopper. If it's indented, it's probably a field grasshopper, but then you'd find it in a field with spare ground. Yeah.
But you should be on the chart there, presumably. Is one of the brownie ones? This end?
What you've just called it. How lovely. But he's not what's in my book. He's not the one with the divided wings. Oh.
You've got chicory, which you tend not to get sort of turning up, except in these waist sides. So that's chicory.
A rather unusual colour, isn't it? The blue of that.
They're gorgeous.
They are, yeah.
The flowers on that.
Quite a clump of it, isn't it?
Quite an interesting article in a fairly recent edition of the British Wildlife. You get that? And they've looked at the provenance of where the seeds came from to go into these wildflower mixes. And years ago, people weren't quite so careful about where the seed was collected from. But now there are people who are actually having fields of whatever it is and harvesting it carefully so that you get West Country mixes and you get Essex mixes. But then does that really matter in the grand scheme of things? Are we being too precious in saying we've got to have Essex sourced stuff? I mean, that should be suited to the climate and so on here, but people have moved stuff around, things come in on birds' feet, they get blown in.
I don't even know whether here we had the say in it or whether, because before the inside of the roundabout was actually forest land, wasn't it?
David was one of the original team involved in its design, and this was a chance for him to revisit the site to see how his recommendations for planting had taken root. It will be interesting to monitor how this area develops in the future, and we intend to record it. A guided walk is an effective way of introducing many people to the features of the park. Aerial views such as this one can give clues to the hidden history beneath our feet. Wanstead House was the biggest and sort of best building in the sort of 18th century. But it was demolished in 1824 because the last owners gambled away all the fortune that was required to support such a grand house and the gardens around it. And the reason for standing here is that the house used to be just about where the golfers are over there underneath that fantastic tree with all the blossom on it. And it only remains now as a hollow in the ground. because the building stone, Portland stone that it was constructed of, was robbed out and sold to meet the debts of the thing. But I'll say a little bit more about that later on. This is the area known as the Long Walk or the Glade. And if you can imagine Buckingham Palace, because a lot of people are very familiar with Buckingham Palace, right? Just across the skyline where the trees are there, right? So the building, which was constructed in 1720-ish, was designed by Colin Campbell, who also did the Mansion House, London, and a number of very other important Palladian mansions. But this one was the first. This idea of having this very stately building, colonnades, at the front, nice sorts of steps going up to the principal floor, which probably would have been about halfway up the trees. Which would have given you a fantastic view if you looked that way towards London, and this way down this avenue to a body of water at the bottom there. And the landscape had in fact been modified quite considerably so that it resembled Versailles. So you've got to sort of think of transplanting gravelled walks, clipped alleyways of trees, parterres and so on, all dotted around the landscape here. But also, if you notice, there's a bit of a hump there. That's one of the two asymmetrically placed mounts on either side of the glade. We're not sure the date of these. There is some sort of tentative hint that they might be prehistoric, but we're not sure. But certainly, if you've got a fairly flat landscape, is it not a good idea when you're digging lakes to put the spoil somewhere? And so it could well be that the prehistoric burial mounds were fairly small, and the earth was just piled on top of them from the lakes to make them much more of a feature, which then became a viewing platform within the gardens. In years gone by, when this was being maintained as the immaculate sort of gardens like the ones at Versailles, there would have been men with scythes out 2 or 3 times a week scything the grass here. In some of the other areas they might well have used sheep to keep the grass short. But you can see the straight bit of water down there, which is called the canal, which is probably the earliest dug lake in the park. We're not sure of the date of that, but it probably is late, sort of 1600s. Stately homes employed bands of Irish navvies to do this, and they obviously went round from Chatsworth to Cannons to the different places to do this. You created lakes around your house. And there is a chain of lakes here in Wanstead. This is known as the ornamental water. Originally it was the Serpentine Lake, and of course the Serpentine in London is contemporary. And of course from a wildlife point of view this is a superb habitat, because you've got all those flowers and leaves and so on, which are providing the flowers providing nectar and pollen for the bees, the leaves, food for the caterpillars, so that in turn will feed the birds. Those caterpillars that don't get eaten will turn into moths or butterflies, and this is a very good place to come and look for bats of an evening, because not only have you got the moths flying around, but you've also got rising up out of the water things like mayflies, which have their larval stage in the water, so that the moth, the bats can come down and feed across the water. I've stopped here because I said I'd do a little bit about sort of tree identification. We've got some sycamores, which are these lovely ones here with these nice big expanded leaves. Sycamores are members of the maple family, and all the maples have leaves in pairs, if you look, you see the sort of leaves come out opposite each other on the stem, and then the next pair go the other way. And this means that when that's facing the light, each leaf has its own space to get as much light as possible. The sycamore, not such a tasty leaf as an oak leaf in terms of the insect life, but on the underside it will in fact have a whole host of aphids. And it's those aphids which are sticking their tongue into the leaves, sucking out the sap, and they suck out so much sap that what they don't need drips out at the end, and that's what makes your car all mucky if you happen to park it underneath a sycamore tree. But somebody said they've seen a ladybird. Little yellow ladybird there, and that will be munching away on the aphids, because ladybirds actually are very good at eating. Pull it up, isn't it? Because it comes up in great big handfuls.
Yeah, it just rolls up,
But
doesn't it?
it's known as goose grass because it is actually quite nutrient rich and you can feed it to the geese. But the reason why it holds on to you is because it's got little tiny hair, hooks all down the leaves there. This is ground ivy. It's a member of the dead nettle family, and you will see whole sheets of it where it occurs because it does sucker very well, send the runners out along the surface of the ground and form great big patches of it. And you may in fact suddenly realise that motorway verges have got a little purple patch on them. And at the moment it's this, yes, it's these patches of ground ivy. Sort of ivy-shaped leaf, but not really very good. It's not the ivy family at all, it's a dead nettle. The dead nettles tend to produce these aromatic compounds as a means of preventing themselves being eaten by caterpillars. And that's why they have these sort of smelly chemicals. It deters the caterpillars from munching. There will be a few caterpillars that are found on them, but dead nettles occur all around the world, but on isolated islands they don't have the smell because they don't need to have means of protecting themselves against so many caterpillars.
Undoubtedly, one of the main surviving features of the grand 18th century gardens are the lakes, and in the next sequence we will hear how these were created and adapted for use on the estate.
So here we are by the ornamental waters. There are many features that survive the grandeur of the 18th century, but one I'd like to point out is known as Engine House Island. And here it is. Completely overgrown today, but records, paintings, estate plans clearly show an engine, whatever that engine was built on the eastern side of this ornamental water around 1715. But by 1740, it had been disused. And indeed, the device or building, whatever it was, finds itself on an island. So the ornamental waters have evolved. But what was this engine house? I would like to think that it was some form of pump, some form of device for raising the level of the water.
Water has featured in park and garden creation since time began. From the Garden of Eden to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, to the humble water feature of our times. But in our historical epoch, there has been nothing to compare with the fountains and canals of Versailles. Versailles was a manifestation of the centralised and absolute power of the King of France. It took a vast system of canals, reservoirs, aqueducts, pumps, water towers and windmills to bring the water to Versailles. It was no accident that the transformation of the gardens of Wanstead by Sir Josiah Child and his heirs followed soon after. Wanstead served to show off the rising power of what John Evelyn called Britain's suddenly moneyed men. Our river Roding may not be so grand, but still the fountains and canals of Wanstead had to be constantly replenished. As Peter Lawrence suggested, the old engine house may well have been a water pump. These old estate maps of 1725 show that the southerly artificial lake system had not yet been constructed, but water was needed to supply the fountains and the canal. The 1712 poem Flora Triumphans, a paean to Sir Richard Child just before the mansion was built, makes a clear reference to the water being supplied by mechanical means.
To make this beauteous urn swelled currents rise, no common fund her watery wealth supplies, neither from trickling rills beneath, nor fed from bounteous heaven's showered favours on her head, even yet more potent aids her streams to extend, must here the auxiliary succours lend.
4 new lakes were created in the shallow valley south of Wanstead House from about 1720 to 1740. Significantly, one was named Reservoir Lake. Research by Barry Hughes has shown how a man-made river known as Adam Holt's River brought water to the basin and to Reservoir Lake. And there are maps and references to other engine and water houses, such as these of 1779 and 1815. The coming of the railways in 1855 cut through Holt's River, and the overland water supply was further disrupted with the building of the M11 link road. The signs are that water gluts and famines will intensify with the onset of global warming. The struggle to keep a constant supply of water has always been, and still is, central to the life and development of Wanstead Park.
I am committed to giving cattle the right to roam, and as I said in my lecture, I think that's vital. It's vital for the sustainable management of the forest as well. Otherwise, it's going to be an ongoing battle against what is a natural succession created by us man taking that vital element out of the equation.
Grazing has been an integral part of the forest's history for many centuries. Commoners kept a few cattle, which grazed the open grasslands of the forest, as well as the water meadows in the valleys of the Roding and the Lee. Each animal was marked with the parish brand, and was free to wander the length and breadth of the forest. As the southern portions of the forest became more urbanised, the number of commoners who kept cows declined, and by the 1960s only a handful of commoners living in the northern areas of the forest were turning out young animals to be fattened up before being sold. In 1996, with beef prices very low and concerns over BSE in herds, it was no longer economic to graze the forest. However, the conservators are exploring ways to retain grazing on the forest because of its ecological importance.
in Bush Wood, which is part of the outpark of Wanstead Park, and it's the second week of May when the grass is growing, the leaves are on the trees and the sun is just breaking through. The grass here has been cut by the tractors in the last couple of days, and we've come to look at some of the features that this has revealed. Grasslands are an important habitat within the forest, and there is a mosaic here of short mown grass and longer grass, amongst which are a series of ant hills. These have been created by the yellow ants, which have gathered together crumbs of soil to make these impressive heaps, some of which are several years old. This one is covered with chickweed and various other plants as well. Ant hills like this one are full of thousands and thousands of yellow ants, and the soil is very fine, and this gives different plants an opportunity to grow. This chickweed, for instance, prefers the loose, disturbed soil, and the whole vegetation here is different from the surrounding grassy area. Obviously, a heap like this isn't home just to ants, but there are spiders and various other creatures associated with the colony. Maintaining grasslands is an important part of the management of Epping Forest, and mowing an area like this would be impractical because not only would it upset the ants, but the blades of the mowing machines are likely to be damaged by the soil here. This is where grazing animals are very important, and they would eat the grass around the anthill and leave these areas undisturbed.
Back in the early 70s, I'd been involved with the play group, and it occurred to me that our local children around here didn't have access, as I had as a young girl, to ponies and Wanstead flats and freedom. And I think horses are very good for people. So I looked around to see if I could do almost an extension of the play group, which was to have perhaps a pony or even 2 ponies and a field shelter. So we needed a piece of land. Well, the piece of land that we found, with the help of a local councillor, was next to a closing down sewage farm. So it was a bit of a pong, and the land itself had been completely left. It was derelict, it had settees and glass bottles and tins under trees. A lot of wildlife. I think it had been part of the Metropolitan Waterable sewage farms, sort of peripheral land. I needed to find out whether anybody wanted ponies here. And because my son was 4 or 5, going to Aldersbrook Primary School, he had lots and lots of friends used to come to the house, and I was like Peter Pan. I went round the local houses and put in the doorways, in the letterboxes, just a short note saying, do you think horses would be an asset to this neighbourhood for the children? And if you do, please tick, and I will collect this this note later when I pass by. And there was I had about 9 children and me, and we went from door to door collecting the replies from local residents, which were very favourable. And I hope people have enjoyed the horses that I've managed to find, and the children seem to have benefited, I think. Many able-bodied, very young children, disabled riders, and adults indeed, who are just starting to realise that riding is a very good way of keeping fit. Exercises all the muscles in the body, rather like swimming does. I'm lucky enough to have help from a lady called Jan, and she comes up right across London and to help. And she says it's like coming into Narnia. You come through the back of the wardrobe and there you are, all greenery and an oasis of peace and tranquility and horses everywhere.
I'm Paul Ferris, and for many years I've been looking at the wildlife of Wanstead Park in association with a wren conservation group. For a long time, many years, I'd looked at first of all the birds, and then later on the plants of the sewage works, as I've always called them, and still call them, although the City of London, the Conservative Epping Forest, I think prefer for it to be known as the Exchange Land, or Aldersbrook Exchange Land, or even Wanstead Exchange Land. But here's the sewage works, and have a little look at it and perhaps talk a little bit more about the history. When the discussions took place about this becoming part of Epping Forest, because it had been a sewage works, the recommendations just turned out that in certain areas that 1.5 feet of topsoil be laid down to cover those areas. And so what I did was ask, instead of just putting a rich topsoil down, or any old topsoil, where they put actually a very sparse soil. I haven't got the expertise to suggest anything in particular, but what they did was exactly right, because they put a sandy gravel down. It worked wonderfully in certain areas where they put this one. Whether they did put 1.5 feet down, I don't know, but where they put it down, still, even after so many years, 1994, the sewage works became part of Epping Forest, and even after so many years, it's still a nice habitat with lots of flowers of the pea family, lots of butterflies using those. It's lovely. One of my favourite spots to stand, I saw water voles down here some 4 years ago. Unfortunately, they haven't been seen since, as far as I know. But what we're looking at is the River Roding, with the Roding floodplain going over to Ilford the other side. And if this does flood, and it does at times, the whole of the golf course can be covered in water. So in effect this is one great lake, which is how it should be. That's what a floodplain should be. But what a lovely stretch of water. Meanders, actually classic meanders. Look at that, you could be absolutely anywhere. Apart from the sound of the A406 in the distance, you could be in the heart of the countryside. You can imagine seeing water voles there. It's a typical environment for them, and they used to be so common. But we've got mink in Wanstead Park now, and mink are well known to be the death of water voles, unfortunately. Who knows, they might come back. The mink might go. I think it's just so beautiful. There's so many wildflowers along here, so many insects. There's a plant called Bargeman's cabbage that grows up in the spring, a yellow flower, and that looks absolutely wonderful along here. I like this. Yeah, this is again one of my favourite little views and walks along here. It's a country scene. It's a green lane. You could be absolutely anywhere walking through here. Here we are, right next to Wanstead Park, just about in London Borough of Redbridge, right next to Newham, and it was a sewage works. There's a path that through this little, well, it actually is a little gateway, which is interesting in its own right, because long before the sewage works was actually, well, whilst the sewage works was a sewage works, because I had officially a key to go in there to do wildlife recording, I knew that along the embankment, which keeps the river Roding out of its floodplain, out of the sewage works, there's a lovely little track, a little path. And I could walk along that because I had access, but now, of course, people can walk along it. And I think that's absolutely wonderful. In fact, when it did become part of Epping Forest, I went through there with a saw and cleared that path so that people could actually use it, only from over things that had fallen across it. And it's a wonderful little walk now. I stood at that spot where we were looking at the Roding, and all you could see was the very top of the Ilford bank. I've got a really dramatic still of it, you know, this sullen clouds looking over to downtown Ilford. Absolutely, it was incredible. This is the boundary of the old sewage works with Wanstead Park, and it's always intrigued me. I don't know how old the boundary is, whether it was built just for the sewage works or whether it's a much more historical boundary. I would like to know more about this embankment actually, how the fence has gone.
There's 3 harebells in the park. I was born in Manor Park, Little Ilford, I suppose, in 1912. I was one of 7 children, the youngest girl, and then I had a brother younger than me. Dear he was. I moved to Gidea Park for a few years and got married from Gidea Park. And I moved here in 1957. So I've been here 50 years, here in this house.
Do you remember when you first went to Wanstead Park? Was that when you lived here or?
Oh no, I first went to Wanstead Park 94 years ago. My mother took me before I was born because I was the youngest girl. I had 6 sisters and they'd all been taken to Wanstead Park in their time. So when I came, I expect I went with my mother and all my sisters before I was born. So that was 94 years ago, and it was just the same as it is now. I could take you around the park and more or less point out the same trees. I expect some of them have grown a bit bigger. Mind you, it's a long time since I walked right round the back of the ornamental lake, which was my usual walk when I went in the park, right the way round. Oh, but it's a long way now. So if I go that way, I'll have to take my stick with me. But, oh yes, and actually, I mean, as my daughter says, she remembers the same as I do. She's only in her 60s, but she remembers going in the park, and in the Wanstead Park Avenue gate, there's a lake each side. And on the right-hand lake, she used to find frog spawn. On the left-hand lake, she found tiddlers. But we didn't have fishing nets. Used to take an old duster or something and drag. Weren't allowed to. If the park keepers had seen us with our... but we used to catch fish. We put them back. We never used to take them home. I mean, there was no point. Everybody paddled. But there weren't many. I mean, there would have been. A few lads would, certainly. But they didn't wear swimming costumes. Oh no, nothing so ordinary as a swimming costume. Or trunks. Because the boathouse, which is now well, it's not the same building, but the boathouse was there, where the building is where we get our cups of tea. And it was piled with boats, one on top of the other, and there were always lots of people in the boats. Hoops, wooden hoops for the girls, iron hoops for the boys. And the boys, why I don't know, but they had a hook on the end of their stick, but we had just a wooden stick. And we used to bowl them all around the place. My daughter was telling me yesterday that she remembered when she was little and we used to go in the park, and we couldn't buy anything in the chalet because we couldn't afford it, but we used to take her in there perhaps to buy a halfpenny gobstopper or something, and they used to look with longing eyes at the cakes in a glass case, but we couldn't afford to buy one. But they were on the counter now. I can see those big glass domes on the counter of the chalet with the cakes in. That was, of course, in the days of the tennis players, because the park was full of tennis courts.
Was it?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, outside the chalet, it was all tennis courts on both sides. And also, outside the park fence, just as you get to the Wanstead Park Avenue gate, there were 2 or 3 tennis courts along there now, which of course is overgrown with bushes. But there were 2 or 3 tennis courts there. So there were masses of tennis players, and they were always in white. They all wore their whites. And each tennis court had a big wooden box about the size of this seat, where they kept their nets. I moved here in 1957, and it was quite different.
In what way was it different?
From now? Well, there was the little house with an elderly couple in it. That was Swiss Cottage, yes. I don't know the date that the Swiss Cottage was knocked down, but it was knocked down, and the house next door, to build what was to be police headquarters. And the police did live there for some years. They used to play football out there and make a lot of noise, which I thoroughly enjoyed, really. But I loved watching them. And one day they were out there playing football, making a terrible noise. I said, "Oh, can you be a bit quieter? I shall have to call the police." I used to like them. We used to watch them calling to each other out of their windows, because it was a very sad day when they left.
Do you remember there was a local sort of campaign, Lena, about...
Oh, yes.
About the future use of that building?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, we did. We all met out there, but I don't know what good it did, I'm sure. But we all certainly got together. No, the cows, yes, they used to keep the traffic down. They used to have to slow down on the Aldersbrook Road. I bet there were many motorists who used to curse them, but no, we didn't.
So you enjoyed them?
Oh, yes. Then, it was when I was small that my mother used to take me along to the farm, where the garage now is in Aldersbrook Road was a farm, and there were cows there. And I was dead scared of cows. I thought they were monsters. But my mother used to take us up to the fence of the farm and try and get us to stroke their noses as they came over towards the fence to us. I expect people used to feed them things, and they'd come to the fence when they saw people. But I was frightened to death of them. But my mother taught me to like them, and so I did. Yeah.
Don't frighten it, please.
Don't follow it. Just leave it to go on its way.
Danny! Danny! They will, yeah. Danny! Will you come here?
In the lounge there, I've got a card presented to me on 50 years of being a member of Aldersbrook Players. And I'm in the next play. It's only a backstage part, but it is. No, it's not. It's front of stage. It's front of house part. One little root of harebell.
And how long have you known that?
All my life, as I can remember. Yes, I used to look for it.
You really will have to show it to me.
Well, it might not be there.
And then I'll show you the other two pages.
There's 3 harebells to find.
My name's Adrian Liddle. I'm one of the litter pickers and I'm here at Wanstead Park down by the ornamental water, and behind me is the canal, which is what we call it anyway. Some people call it the Strait. There's about 11 litter pickers throughout the forest and we all have various areas that we cover. My areas are Wanstead Park, where we are at the moment, Manor Park Flats, Gilbert Slade and part of High Beach. I come into the park, generally speaking, every Monday because the weekends get very busy indeed, and we try to clear the place up. We get a lot of rubbish, especially around the tea hut area, and which consists of bottles, throwaway teacups, food wrappings and things like that. Around the lakes we have problems with people who come into the park at night who do drinking and perhaps have barbecues, which of course is totally illegal. We also get problems with some of the fishermen who leave their tins of drink and also their broken rods and things in the bushes, so we have to clear those up. So it's a busy time in here. We can't do all the park in one go, but we try to get round, and we do rely immensely on people who use the park every day, the dog walkers and the people who just run in here or walk, to let us know if there's any problems. Of course, most of the rubbish we pick up are the takeaway food items, but of course occasionally we do find things a little bit more extraordinary and out of the ordinary. Terrapin. It's obviously come out from one of the lakes and was walking across the green behind the tea hut and it got stuck. and I would think he's looking for a home now, if he is a he. We always get asked, do we find money? And luckily we do find the odd coin, and it has been known to find a fiver. But generally speaking, we haven't found any sort of large caches of money, and I shan't tell you if I do. But we do find very strange things. We cleared out Alexandra Lake last year when it dried up, and we found what we thought was an unexploded bomb, and they arranged for the bomb squad to come down. But that turned out to be the suspension unit of a lorry. But at the same time as doing that, we found a carrier bag that was very heavy, and when we opened it up, inside was a handgun. The more common things that we find, unfortunately, are the fly tips, and it's amazing how far people will carry items like fridges, furniture, mattresses into the forest, which we've then got to drag out. We find motorbikes, bits of cars, anything that people want to get rid of. They will struggle into the forest or into the park here and dump it, and then we have to try and get it out again, which is a great shame, of course, because it spoils the beauty of the place. We also get asked if we find bodies. Well, so far the only bodies I have found are people who are alive. Generally speaking, they're hermits or tramps, or just down and outs who have nowhere to live. The hermits and the tramps, they tend to try and live in the forest, and we get to find where they are, and it's amazing what amount of gear that they take in with them that they've managed to find to build little sort of houses inside the forest. But the down and outs, unfortunately, the people who are homeless, they generally tend just to have a mattress or a sleeping bag, and we find them just lying under a tree, fast asleep during the day. And what we do then, we notify the keepers, and they try and find somewhere for them to go, like a hostel or a halfway house, so that they get some sort of rehousing, because the last thing we want are people to die from hypothermia, which of course can happen. Yes, this rubbish has been placed here by people who have picked it in the park. They've bagged it up. Unfortunately, the bags are too big to put in the bin, so they've been very careful and left the bags next to the bin. But of course, what's happened overnight is the fox and the crows have come along, ripped all the bags up, and this is what you see. The wind's got into it, and the stuff has spread all over the place, which is a great shame, because the people who've left it here obviously have tried to keep the park tidy. But what we would ask of people, if you've come with bags of food, is to take the rubbish home, so that this sort of situation won't happen overnight and give us more work to do.
He looked funny, wouldn't he?
Morning, Barbara. Thanks for me tea.
Morning.
Oh, just about ready for this. It's a ridgeback, isn't it?
No.
It's not. It must be a Rizzler then.
That's it.
Of course, it's often said that if the litter pickers all disappeared, the forest would be under about a foot of rubbish within a very short amount of time. And that's probably very true. And you'd certainly notice if we weren't around. But the most of us are all sort of semi-retired, and we do it because we have a social conscience. We feel that the forest needs to be looked after. We enjoy doing what we do, and we like to see the forest looking in its natural state.
Yeah, my name is John Maestri, and I'm here with a good wife. She's been running the kiosk for about 20-something years. We've come here in '85, when it was then a boathouse. Eventually, the Corporation of London, very nice people, asked us if we would like to build a new kiosk, which we did. And
we opened it in '87.
Yes, '87, and we've been here ever since. The place is full of nice people, very, very nice, and the place is lovely. Surrounding are absolutely gorgeous.
And the people,
we're very, very happy here.
The people that come here are think this is their garden.
Yeah.
And they treasure it.
I don't know much about that, Jeannie Babe would, because she practically lives here 7 days a week. She knows everybody by their names.
And the dogs' names. Well, we get lots and lots of dog walkers, and they gather outside the steps and all meet up. And
5,000 different types.
And they know one another by the dogs' names and what have you, and they, you know, have rounds on buying tea. It's their turn. They're all very friendly, and they all know one another for coming to the park year after year with, you know, meeting the same people. I have people that have gone abroad, lived in Australia, they've come back from Canada, that have been gone for maybe 30 years, but they've had to come back to the park to relive their youth. And they come and stand at the hatch and tell me what they did when they was like 11, 12, up to 16. And they've all had to come back just because it's still in their memory, and they reckon it hasn't altered that much. It's so nice. And even people that have moved away from the area, they still come back with perhaps their grandchildren to show them what they did when they were young. It's nice. The school kids come through, and I've got kids that have come through and now they come up with their own children, which makes me feel like I'm getting old. Well, I'm very lucky because I've got 5 children, and as they've all grown up and left school, they've all done their bit in helping me. They've all been Saturday boys or Saturday girls and helped me, and then they've gone on to do their own thing. But it's all giving them a start on, you know, dealing with the public. And John, I'm very lucky because he always brings me all my stock. And so I don't have to do that side of it. He always makes sure he delivers it to me.
Does he ever work behind the counter?
No.
Since we've took over, we and put that building there, we think we like to know that we've got a bit of conscience, and we are open every single day, unless of course it's raining or snowing. You know, we was hoping for Christmas when it was snowing. It was very nice. It was an absolute pleasure. The lake was all iced up. All the children were over there and having a hell of a time. It was very good. But it has not snowed ever since.
I'm quite happy as it is. It would be nice if they could bring the boats back, because a lot of people here have said, you know, it used to be a boating lake and it would be nice to see like boats back. But that is so long ago now.
Do you think they'll bring the cows back?
Well, they are bringing back animals now in parts of Epping Forest, but I don't know if there's anything on the agenda for here.
as I remember, there is only a slight memorandum in the great drawing book relating to a Roman pavement discovered about 20 years ago in Sir Richard Child's, now Earl Tilney's, park at Wanstead in Essex. That there was a border about a foot broad went round it, composed of red dice and about 3/4 of an inch square, within which were several ornaments, and in the middle the figure of a man riding upon some beast and holding something in his hands. This pavement was situated on a gently gravelly ascent towards the north, and at a small distance from the south end of it I remember a well of exceeding fine water, now absorbed in a great pond. Mr. Adam Holt, the gardener, perceiving several of the tesserae thrown up, soon conjectured what he was upon, and earnestly endeavoured, though in vain, to obtain leave to lay it quite open.
Today we're here together to improve our knowledge and techniques with the magnetometry equipment. As one can imagine, the use of these sort of things requires lots of skill as well as lots of experience. All of us have used these machines, but really we just have to keep on training. Now that we've got the official permission to commence work in the park, the permission from the Corporation of London, we're just carrying out a few random test exercises with the machine, just to see if we have a similar problem with all the 18th century landscaping that we had here. We suspect that we won't have as much of a problem because in the past magnetometry has been done here successfully. But it's all part of our learning curve, and we're not right down at the bottom as we were a few months ago. We're creeping up the side of that learning curve successfully.
The learning curve that we're involved in here relates to the early 1960s, when I became friends with the late Jack Elsden Tufts, when Jack and I were active in Wanstead Park. He'd been doing this work long before I met him, using, of course, in those days, primitive means compared with the technology we have today. He did in fact manage to get a group of younger people and formed what was then known as the Wanstead Archaeological Group.
We came in Wanstead Park when we were approached by the then superintendent, I suppose you call it, Mr. Quist, QV, as you probably know. It was the centenary of handing over the park, etc., and there have been a few. We were asked to look for this Roman villa. It had previously been looked for by Elsden Tufts, who, though he'd found a few bits of remains, had not located the villa. We got permission from all the bits of people necessary, and he said, if you find a villa and it's a big enough one, we will raise the money to have it all preserved and put out, etc., etc.
This might be interesting to you. That's your handwriting, is it?
Yes, yes, it's mine.
Okay, there's some very interesting comments. I mean, can you read that well enough to read it out?
Yes, yes, yes. There is also a Roman tiled pavement in the perch pond near the pump intake, which appears to be in situ.
So the pavement was back down in this direction, going out
yes, it was
into
just
the lake? Was there any direction to it?
Not really, because there wasn't enough tiles to, you put a square of tiles down, you know which direction it's facing.
How big roughly were these tiles?
They were only about 3 or 4 tiles square in each direction.
So
it wasn't a lot.
a foot by foot square, or what they?
I suppose about 2'6" square, something like that. That's all.
Each of the tiles, or the whole?
No, the whole lot. It was
about
only half a dozen tiles.
Half
there.
a dozen tiles.
Yeah.
So did you actually recover any of those tiles?
No.
You didn't recover any of them?
Not at all. We went back and thought, right, and when we came back, somebody pinched it up.
Okay. Well, I was saying, so if and when the digging goes ahead, you've got an archaeological watch on it, haven't you?
Yes.
Yeah? And so, I mean, what else would you be asking of Thames?
What I'm asking of Thames is to do a couple of those just exploratory keyhole excavations.
Right, I mean, I can't say that today.
No.
What we can do, I can go back and I can speak with Mark.
It would be Mark. I think that although you've got quite compelling evidence to say it's here, then there is other evidence that says it might not necessarily be here, particularly the geophys survey.
Yeah, there's a good reason, the geophys survey, and that's definitely to do with the depth.
But then having said that, if it's to do with the depth, it's going to go down to the depth that we need to lay our pipes at. So if there is a Roman villa 4 metres down, if we lay our pipes 2 metres down, we're not going to do anything to it.
If, again, we don't know. I mean, it's an opportunity at this stage to actually try and find out.
But, and this isn't my point of view, but Thames Water won't... I mean, it goes against the government's planning policy statement number 16. It says you don't go out of your way to uncover archaeology.
You will.
So there's no way that we could argue to Thames Water, the people that hold the purse strings, that this is a good thing to do.
We already know that it could be the nearest Roman villa to London.
I mean, what does the City of London say about it?
Well, the owners, or if you like, the people who own it.
What do they say about it?
They would do something if people, showed an interest in it. I've had some various comments about we'd rather leave it alone. We don't want to expose it. It would give us extra expense if we're protecting it. And I don't doubt that. I don't want a massive museum here, right? I just want to know what we've got, what the extent of it is.
If you find something, then what do you do?
I want to know what we've got and the extent of it. Somewhere here we've got a high-class villa.
Somewhere here there might have been a high-class villa.
No, there was.
No, I'm sorry. You've got some artefacts of flue tiles.
Yeah.
And flue tiles will be used in a hypercourse.
We've got painted wall
How big?
plaster as well.
Hang on.
Yeah, okay.
You might well have got a building here which had that. Until you find a structure rather than odd fragments.
Absolutely.
You haven't got the evidence to support that, because I think the artefacts are too limited to support that.
I agree with that. I
disagree. Where was it?
I think some of the artefacts are fairly easy to find and fairly well distributed. So
yeah, that's the
problem. It's definitely something. The only way you're going to even start to find it, because we're not going to dig the site up. I mean,
no, you won't be allowed to. You've got to do exploratory.
Is to use non-invasive techniques.
Yeah. It's not going to be a small building. I mean, to get an idea of the scale, you've got to really go and look at what's that place in Kent? Lunningstone. I mean, there's the floor that was described here by Lethulia, or the pavements described by Adam Holt to Lethulia, was 20 feet by 16 feet. Now, that's much bigger than the tessellated floor that's in Lunningstone Villa. You get a perception of the scale of that villa with its baths and everything, and its little chapel on the side. It's not a small construction. It's got it would extend from the lake to here easily.
Yeah, look, I'm not quite sure where this is going.
No, okay.
I would be very supportive of some archaeological investigations in the park. Yes.
Good.
When and how it's funded is another issue.
Right.
But I've got no problems with an archaeological investigation over bits of the park. I mean, we're not going to scan.
A momentous moment.
Yep.
Right.
On the pink glass and all that.
There you go.
Wanstead Park.
Wanstead Park.
Cheers.
Well done. Cheers.
Simply trying to locate these things, locate the finds from excavations carried out over the last 50, 60, 70 years or more. so that we as a group have an understanding where this material is, so that we can then work out how we can design new projects. We don't intend to gather it all together ourselves. We don't intend to create a museum or a store for this material, although the information that we gather will be very useful to allow the managers of archaeology in this part of London to determine needs, what the archive does need. But apart from that, though, the most important thing is that we now have another opportunity not just to re-examine the site, but also to enjoy ourselves with some of these gadgets and kit, and to examine once again the archaeology here. But the important point is if you were standing here, say 2,000 years ago, 7 AD, it would look quite different, I'm sure. That the natural slopes would be more defined, with the streams running down here, the roading over there. It's likely, my feeling is that the roading was probably tidal just to the north of us here, which would have meant that you could cross the roading much easier at low tides than at high tides. And it's more than likely that running across the north of the site would have been some old trackways, prehistoric trackways, to get access from the east to the west. Obviously, heading in the west, you're not heading to Londinium in 7 AD, it didn't exist. You're going to go in beyond that, maybe to the good crossing areas for the Thames around the Westminster area or that part of the landscape. And these crossing points here make this an excellent location with the tidal resource of the roading for food and transport, with these natural prehistoric trackways, with all of the raw materials you see around you. This is a place where you would expect there to be some sort of pre-Roman occupation. We now are almost certain that if you had a Roman building with such an elaborate mosaic, then it's likely to be the main residential building for a large villa complex, a building which would have contained more than just one wing of rooms. Where we see these things elsewhere throughout Roman Britain and other parts of the northwest Roman provinces, these are massive estates. They would have been the equivalent of today of sort of affluent working farm, where a very wealthy family, a family who are making their money from land, from produce of that land, and from both cereal, grain, as well as animal livestock. They would have owned many, many hectares in the area, farmed it in quite an intensive manner. And you can imagine this site here, the large villa complex here, with those communication routes that I mentioned, you would then be in a very, very good, very, very fortunate position. We know well the Roman road coming down from Dunmow, passing through Little London, which may be Duroletum, or is almost certainly, we think now, Duroletum, a Roman town which appears on the Antonine itinerary. A Roman map of the 2nd century AD. But there's also the likelihood that the road running from Kaiser Amargus or Chelmsford also ran across this area, and those two roads would have met just on the eastern side of the roading, just to the northeast of us here, and joined to create one route which then crossed somewhere to the north of us here, going towards Londinium.
It's a slice through a three-dimensional reconstruction of a ground penetrating survey that we did a couple of weeks ago in this exact area here, running 35 metres just to the left, just to the right of the trees, and 14 metres across. Okay, what we did was half a metre, what they call transects, and then by processing the signals to amplify those features that you're really interested in, and then stacking it together, and the software does a very clever slice through this as if you'd actually excavated. So what we're looking at here is notionally about 2 metres deep. Okay, and I think you can see that we've got features coming through here with parallel and rectangular.
Show me again with the finger.
Here.
All those parallel lines and perpendicular.
There's evidence of other lines coming through here as well.
They are not natural features, they are likely to be man-made features. That's the objective interpretation, but when you start thinking about the history and antiquity of this site, then you start to believe, well, perhaps this is the Roman building that we've been looking for. There are other possible candidates, I suppose, medieval or post-medieval.
Well, the only one that I can think of is in our chronology, in 1619 there was a spa in operation here, which could have been linked to the well and spring that we know is just down there in the middle of the islands. So that's a possibility, but even so it would be a great find. You don't find too many Elizabethan or early pre-Elizabethan spas around here.
Whatever it is, I think we're safe in saying it's a building of some
sort.
Yeah. But once we continue the survey to the east and to the west behind us, maybe a little bit more to the north, then if the ground plan of this structure continues, then we'll probably be able to identify it architecturally. No, when I first saw your results, I thought they were pretty good, especially since they were done objectively.
Yeah.
You didn't know what it was that you were looking for. So I was 75-80% confident that you had found something.
Yeah. You have to remember, this is only the third time I've used that radar kit.
Well, you're a natural.
And only the fourth time it's been used since it was bought. And I'm obviously a little concerned about it. Since I've read a single book about it, I now understand all the pitfalls that can crop up. Certainly in terms of the analysis and the processing of the data. You can process in more artifacts if you're not careful. And then it's kind of looking like clouds. Seeing what you can see in clouds. But
you're a classic scientist, aren't you? You want to say?
So we were going up and down here, ½ metre spacing. It tends to suggest that we've got several levels here.
Right.
So we may have more than one structure on top of another. Slightly different angles.
Well, because they don't line up. It's not just like a higher bit of wall left.
Actually, if we've agreed that this is not invasive, if we've agreed in principle that this is not invasive, this is enabling, then in actual fact you don't need a variation to your licence. We just need to agree the programme of works that you're going to do in terms of auguring, subject to the advice that you get and we ratify. So by the middle of June we could actually have an agreement of what auguring technique to use. I think we've just agreed that we're going to do 4 holes, regardless of which, with either technique.
Yeah.
Are you happy with that? Yeah?
Yeah.
Good.
Good for me.
Great.
All right. Excellent.
Success.
Okay. There we go. Decon. It's all right. Yeah, what we are doing is locating a number of auger boreholes down this line of the GPR survey. The first one's been located at this point here, in a line with some of the features that we've identified, and that has revealed a natural surface with redeposited material on top of it. Nothing which is shouting out Roman villa or Roman archaeology, but it's still giving us good levels from which we can reconstruct the depths of archaeology and the depths of overburden on the site. Putting in every 25 metres, so one here, one down here, one down here. What's that? 1, 2, 3, 4.
We've got permission to do 4, and we think we can get quite a lot of useful information just from the 4 holes. It is a very complicated process now for us to determine politically the next stage, I think. Yeah.
It's going to require a lot of debate.
Yeah.
My personal professional feeling is that the next step could be much greater than anything that could be conducted by WPCP and WEAG together.
Yeah.
It may have to involve other third parties.
Almost certainly.
And significant funding.
Yeah, very significant funding is my feeling. I mean, the exercise today, I think, is going to give us a good indication of how much material would need to move, I think, in my sort of layman's terms, before we get to the archaeology.
It starts applying absolutes, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
So what will our next DVD bring? We'll be looking at the existing buildings, the golf club, the church, the temple and the grotto, and aspects of buildings that have gone before. Has Ralph Potter finally unearthed a Roman villa? Has historian Stephen Pusey located the wealth of materials swept away with the demolition of the mansion? We will look in depth at the role of the East India Company in the rise and fall of Wanstead House. We will look at the cultural life, the seminal work of astronomers Pound and Bradley, and the poets, musicians and artists such as John Dowland, Philip Sidney, William Hogarth and Thomas Hood. And of course, more on the natural aspect, the evolution of the landscape, the work of the Epping Forest volunteers and others such as the Wren Group in maintaining the park and recording and protecting its flora and fauna. There will be more cafe people, the people who use the park and the people who make it work. Looking ahead, we intend to have a section called Beyond the Pale, in which the life and activities of Wanstead Flats, Lake House, Aldersbrook and the village itself are featured. We began this DVD by saying that Wanstead Park is our garden. Wanstead Parklands is part of Epping Forest. The future of the park and that of the forest are inextricably bound up. So, watch this space.